opened my father's suicide note, and the first line stopped my heart. "Claire, I didn't kill myself." The words sat there in black ink on cheap printer paper, so ordinary and devastating that for a long moment I couldn't breathe. My father had been dead for 3 months. The coroner called it suicide. The police called it suicide. Everyone who knew about his severe depression, the kind that dragged him under for weeks at a time, that made him stare at walls and forget to eat, that turned a vibrant, brilliant man into a ghost who could barely get out of bed, called it suicide. No sign of struggle. No forced entry. Just my father alone in his study with an empty pill bottle on the desk and a glass of water that had gathered a thin film of dust. I had accepted all of it. I had deleted his number from my phone, packed his clothes into black garbage bags, moved out of the house on Maple Street where I'd grown up. I had told myself, over and over, that acceptance was the only way to survive. That some questions don't get answers. That closure is a myth we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. Now this letter was shaking in my hands, and everything I had painstakingly rebuilt was crumbling to dust. My fingers trembled so violently I could barely make out the words that followed. If you're reading this, it means I'm already gone. Go to my study. Inside the dust jacket of 100 years of solitude is a letter for you. Remember, trust no one. Not even your mother. Not even your mother. My mother died when I was a sophomore in high school. 9 years ago. I had stood in a funeral home wearing a black dress that didn't fit right, the fabric stiff and foreign against my skin, surrounded by flowers that smelled cloying and sickly sweet. I had watched the casket lower into the frozen ground on a gray November morning while a minister said words I couldn't hear over the roaring in my ears. I hadn't seen a photograph of her in a decade. My father had taken them all down, packed them away somewhere, and I had never asked why. Now my father, reaching out from beyond the grave, was warning me about a dead woman. It had to be his illness talking. The depression must have twisted his thoughts toward paranoia in those final months, poisoning his mind with fears that had no basis in reality. That's what I told myself, standing there in my apartment with the letter crumpling in my grip. That's what I needed to believe. But I still went to his study. The house on Maple Street had been locked up since the funeral. The real estate agent said it would be hard to sell. Too much history, too much tragedy seeped into the walls like cigarette smoke. I unlocked the front door with the key I hadn't been able to throw away, and the smell hit me immediately, old paper and dust and something else, something that stopped me dead in the doorway. His cologne. Faint but unmistakable, still clinging to the air 3 months after his death, like a ghost that refused to leave. I stood there in the dark hallway, my hand pressed flat against the cold wall, and for a moment I was 15 again, coming home from school to find him reading in his worn leather armchair, looking up at me with that gentle, tired smile that always made me feel safe. I shook it off and walked to the study. My footsteps echoed in the empty house. The bookshelf stood against the far wall, floor-to-ceiling mahogany that my father had built himself one summer when I was 8. I remembered handing him screws and holding the level while he whistled off-key. I found 100 Years of Solitude on the third shelf, its spine worn soft and cracked from years of rereading. He had read it to me when I was too young to understand it, his voice low and rhythmic, and I had fallen asleep against his shoulder more times than I could count. He told me once that every family had its own version of that book, a story of secrets passed down like heirlooms, of ghosts that never quite left the house. He had said it with such sadness in his eyes that I'd never forgotten it. I tore open the dust jacket. A single folded sheet of paper fell out, drifting to the floor like a dead leaf. I picked it up with fingers that felt numb. For words, written in my father's careful, slanted handwriting, I recognized the distinctive hook of his A's, the way he closed his G's, the slight upward tilt of his T's. This was his writing. Undeniably his. You are not mine. My hands shook so violently I had to sit down. The leather chair creaked under me, his chair, the one he'd spent countless nights in, the one where he'd probably sat before he swallowed those pills. For 23 years I had been Claire Miller. I had his eyes, dark brown with flecks of gold that caught the light. I had his laugh, the one that started low and built into something full-throated and infectious. I had his long fingers and his habit of biting my lip when I was thinking. I had never questioned any of it. Why would I? I was his daughter, and he was my father, and that was the bedrock my entire life was built on. Now those 4 words had torn my identity apart. I felt dizzy, untethered, like the floor had dropped out from under me and I was falling through empty space. I turned the paper over. 6 more words, written smaller, pressed hard into the paper as if he'd been running out of time or courage. Your real mother is still alive. Real mother. The woman who had given birth to me. The woman whose body I had never known, whose voice I had never heard, whose scent I had never breathed in. She was alive somewhere, breathing and walking and existing in the world, and my father had known. For 23 years, he had known. Why had he hidden it? Why had he let me call a stranger Mom, let me grieve a woman who wasn't mine, let me build my entire sense of self on a foundation of lies? The questions slammed into me one after another, each one harder than the last, until I was doubled over in his chair with my head in my hands, tears I hadn't even felt starting to fall. I called Frank Clark, my father's oldest friend. They had met in college, 30 years ago, back when my father still believed in things like loyalty and brotherhood. Frank had been at every family gathering I could remember, a permanent fixture at Thanksgiving dinners and summer barbecues, the man who slipped me extra dessert when my parents weren't looking. He was the one who'd held me at the funeral when my legs gave out, his arms solid and steady around my shoulders. Uncle Frank, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. What do you know about my dad's death? Silence on the other end. The kind of silence that stretches too long, that means someone is deciding what to say. Then, why are you asking this now, Claire? I found something. Something he left for me. Another pause. I could hear him breathing, slow and measured. I'll come by in the morning. We'll talk then. He hung up before I could say anything else. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the apartment turned on, the suicide note spread out on the coffee table in front of me, and I stared at it until the words blurred together and lost all meaning. At 4 a.m, a thought crawled into my mind and refused to leave. If my mother died 9 years ago, why did my father's note mention her? Unless she wasn't dead. But I had been at her funeral. I had knelt at her casket in that funeral home, the wood cold and smooth under my trembling fingers. Except, I had never actually seen her face. I had squeezed my eyes shut as tight as I could, too afraid to look at death, too afraid to remember her that way. The casket had been closed for the burial. What if the body inside wasn't her? What if the woman I'd mourned, the woman whose grave I'd visited every year on her birthday, was someone else entirely? The thought made me physically ill. I spent an hour in the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink, trying to breathe through the nausea that rolled through me in waves. At 8 o'clock sharp, Frank arrived with a paper bag of bagels and 2 coffees, just like he used to bring on Saturday mornings when I was a kid. He looked the same as always, slightly rumpled, graying at the temples, with the kind of dependable ordinariness that made people trust him instinctively. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I handed him the paper I'd found in the book. No preamble. No explanation. He read it, and I watched his face. His brow furrowed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But he didn't look surprised. That was the first thing that struck me. He didn't look surprised at all. It was the look of someone who had been expecting this, who had been waiting for a bomb to go off and was almost relieved that the moment had finally arrived. "Do you know about my real mother?" I asked. The word real felt strange in my mouth, like a splinter I couldn't work loose. He was silent for a long moment, his coffee cooling untouched between his hands. Then he said, very quietly, "Your biological mother is still alive." The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "Where is she?" And Frank told me a story. My father, he said, had loved a woman named Elena Davis. They met in graduate school. She was brilliant, passionate, the kind of woman who lit up every room she walked into. It was the kind of love that burns hot and fast and leaves permanent marks on everyone it touches. But my father's parents were old-fashioned people with old-fashioned ideas about who their son should marry. They had already chosen Margaret, proper, wealthy, well-connected Margaret, whose family money could rescue the Miller name from a string of bad investments. And my father, young and weak and terrified of being cut off from everything he'd ever known, did what they asked. He married Margaret. But Elena was already pregnant. When she told him, it was too late. The wedding had happened, the ink was dry on the marriage certificate, and Margaret knew. Somehow, Margaret knew. And instead of leaving, instead of exposing the scandal and walking away, Margaret made a decision that Frank said even he couldn't fully understand. She agreed to raise me as her own. Elena, broken and exiled, left the country with a check in her pocket and a hole in her heart. I felt sick. The bagel in front of me might as well have been made of ash. "He lied to me for 23 years, I said, my voice cracking. 23 years of looking me in the eye and calling me his daughter. Every birthday, every Christmas, every bedtime story, all of it built on a lie. And he called that protection." I pulled out the suicide note and pushed it across the table. "Here. Read this." Frank picked it up, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to something harder. Something colder. He studied the paper for what felt like a long time, turning it over in his hands, holding it up to the light. Then he said, "This isn't your father's handwriting." "What?" "Look here." He pointed at the letter with a steady finger. "The has no hook at the bottom. Your father always hooked his A's, always." I watched him write 100 times. "And the G is open, see?" Daniel closed his G's like this. He demonstrated on a napkin, sketching a letter with a precise, practiced stroke, and my stomach dropped because he was right. I remembered my father's handwriting from birthday cards and grocery lists, the distinctive loops and hooks that I tried to copy as a child. The handwriting in the note was close, close enough to fool someone who wasn't looking carefully, but it wasn't his. It was a forgery. A very good one, but a forgery nonetheless. "Someone forged this," Frank said, his voice flat and certain. "Someone wanted you to find this note. Someone wanted you to start asking questions." His recognition had been too quick. Too precise. Almost like he'd been expecting to find a forgery. Almost like he'd known what he was looking for. But I was too dazed to follow that thread, too overwhelmed by the avalanche of revelations that kept burying me. Instead, I just nodded. "There's someone you need to meet," Frank said. "Someone who can explain everything." He drove me across town to a part of the city I rarely visited, a neighborhood of aging apartment buildings with peeling paint and bars on the windows, the kind of place where people minded their own business because everyone had something to hide. Third floor of a building that smelled like cooking oil and stale cigarette smoke. Apartment 305. Frank knocked on the door with a rhythm that felt practiced, familiar, like he'd done it many times before. No answer. We waited. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a steady, anxious drumbeat. Then footsteps, slow and shuffling, from inside. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman in a dark dress appeared in the doorway, holding a plastic grocery bag. She had tired eyes and graying hair pulled back in a loose bun, and when she saw me, her face went through a series of expressions I couldn't track: shock, disbelief, something that looked almost like terror. The grocery bag slipped from her fingers. Apples rolled across the dingy hallway carpet, bumping against my shoes. "Claire," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh my God. Claire." She dropped to her knees right there in the hallway, her hands reaching toward me like I was something holy, something she'd been waiting her whole life to touch. "My daughter. Oh God, my daughter. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to leave you. I never wanted any of this." Her name, she told me once we were inside her cramped, cluttered apartment, was Elena Davis. She made us tea with shaking hands, apologizing for the state of the place, for the mess, for the stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter, for everything. She seemed to apologize for her own existence, and that made something in my chest ache despite the numbness. Then she told me her version of the story. She said that Margaret wasn't the selfless woman Frank had described. Margaret, she said, had faked her own death 9 years ago, taken company funds that weren't hers, and disappeared into a new life. My father, she said, had found Margaret 3 months ago, had tracked her down somehow, confronted her, demanded answers. And then, 3 months ago, my father was dead. "Margaret is still alive," Elena said, her voice cracking. "She's out there somewhere. And I know, she's dangerous. Your father wasn't supposed to die. He was supposed to help me come home. I demanded a DNA test." The words came out of me hard and cold, and Elena flinched but nodded. 3 days, she said. She knew a private lab that could rush the results. I stayed with her during those 3 days, sleeping on her lumpy pull-out couch, listening to her tell me about her life, the years in Europe, the loneliness, the daughter she never stopped thinking about. She showed me a silver locket she wore around her neck with a tiny photograph of me as a baby, my face round and unformed, my eyes wide and trusting. She cried a lot. I sat there stiffly, not knowing what to feel, caught between the desperate hope that I'd found my real mother and the bone-deep fear that this was another lie in a life that had turned out to be built on them. On the 3rd day, the results came back. Elena Davis was my biological mother. The probability was 99.99%. The paper said it in black and white, definitive and irrefutable. We sat at her kitchen table, the lab report spread between us, and Elena reached for my hand. I let her take it. Her fingers were cold and thin. I felt numb. I should have felt something, joy, relief, anger, grief, but there was nothing. Just a hollow emptiness where my emotions should have been, a vast white space that stretched in every direction. I called Frank to tell him, but before I could get the words out, his voice cut through with an edge I'd never heard before. "It's Elena," he said. "She's dead. Overdose." The paramedics just, "Claire, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." I don't remember driving to the hospital. I don't remember walking through the fluorescent-lit corridors or finding her room or pushing past the nurse who tried to stop me. What I remember is standing beside her bed, looking down at her still, pale face, and seeing the piece of paper clutched in her stiffening hand. A suicide note, smeared with blood where she'd pressed her fingers to the page, as if she'd been trying to hold on to it, to make sure someone found it. I pried it from her grip with fingers that didn't feel like my own. Claire, I didn't kill your father. But I know who did. He's still close to you. Be careful. The person who... The rest was a smear of dried blood, dark and rust-colored. She had died trying to write the name. She had died reaching for the truth. Frank stood behind me, his hand heavy on my shoulder. And in that moment, standing in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and death and the faint floral scent of the shampoo Elena had used that morning, a thought sliced through my grief like a blade through fog. Cold. Precise. Devastating. How had Frank known where Elena lived? He'd taken me straight to her apartment, knocked on her door like he'd done it 100 times. How had he spotted the forged handwriting so instantly, with such absolute confidence? How had he known exactly what to look for, as if he'd been expecting it, as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask? I turned around slowly. Frank's face was a mask of sympathy, carefully arranged, but something flickered behind his eyes when he met my gaze. Something watchful. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Who are you? I whispered. Really? And his mask slipped. It happened in stages. First the sympathetic expression faded, replaced by something flat and evaluating. Then his posture changed, his shoulders straightened, his chin lifted, and he looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Like I'd finally become interesting. Like I'd finally walked into a trap he'd been setting for years. I killed your father, he said. The words didn't make sense at first. They bounced off my brain like stones skipping over water, refusing to sink in. Frank had been at my birthday parties. Frank had taught me to ride a bike when my father was too depressed to get out of bed, running alongside me with his hand on the seat until I found my balance. Frank had held me at the funeral, his voice gentle in my ear, telling me everything was going to be okay. Frank was family. 30 years ago, he pushed me out of the company, Frank said, his voice calm and conversational, as if he was discussing stock prices or the weather. He had evidence of my embezzlement, a stupid mistake I made when I was young and desperate and drowning in debt. He held it over my head for decades. Every decision I made, every job I took, every move in my career, I had to ask his permission. I was his puppet, and he pulled my strings whenever he felt like it. His lip curled, and something ugly surfaced in his eyes. I hated him. I hated him more than I've ever hated anyone. I practiced his handwriting for 3 years. Every night, after my wife went to bed, I sat at my desk and copied his letters until I could write them in my sleep. I wanted chaos. I wanted everything he built to burn. I wanted to tear his life apart the way he tore mine apart. And Elena. My voice came out as a rasp, barely recognizable as my own. I gave her a little push. That's all. He shrugged, a casual roll of his shoulders. I told her you'd never forgive her for abandoning you. I told her the guilt would eat her alive, that she'd spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for you to reject her. She made her own choice after that. Another shrug. I didn't force the pills down her throat. I just helped her see the truth of her situation. I lunged at him. I don't remember deciding to do it. One moment I was standing still, frozen in place, and the next I was on him, my fists swinging, my nails clawing at his face, every ounce of rage and grief and betrayal pouring out of me in a blind, animal fury. He was stronger than me, older but solid, and he pinned my arms to my sides with practiced ease, his fingers digging into my wrists hard enough to bruise. I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until the sound echoed off the hospital walls, and Frank just held me there with that calm, almost bored expression on his face. Then the door burst open, and the room filled with police officers. I had called them. Sitting in the parking lot before I went inside, I'd gotten a text from an unknown number, Elena's phone. Her final message, sent from somewhere beyond the grave: Frank Clark killed your father. He's using you. Get help. I had dialed 911 with shaking fingers, barely able to press the numbers, and told them everything I knew. Frank was dragged away in handcuffs, still wearing that strange, serene smile. I watched him go, and I felt something inside me break and reform into something harder. 3 months later, I stood at my father's grave. It was a cold morning in early December, the grass brown and frozen under my feet, the sky a pale, washed-out gray. I had come alone, a bouquet of white roses clutched in my gloved hand. I knelt in the dead grass and pressed my palm flat against the cold granite of his headstone. "I'm going to be okay," I whispered. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to be okay. I promise. And I'm going to find out the truth, all of it. For both of us." I stood up, brushed the dead grass from my knees, and turned to leave. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a work email, a text from a friend. 11 words from an unknown number: "Your mother isn't dead. She's waiting for you. Don't trust anyone." I stared at the screen, my breath misting in the cold air. Margaret Miller was still alive. And I had to find her. For a solid week, I stared at that message. I read it at breakfast and before bed, and in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, the phone screen glowing pale blue in the darkness of my apartment. 11 words that had upended my life for the second time in 3 months. I didn't know who had sent it. I didn't know if I could trust it. But the words burrowed into my mind like a splinter, and I couldn't shake them loose. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face. Elena's face. The blood-smeared note. The questions I couldn't answer. I went back to my father's house, the house on Maple Street that still hadn't sold, that still smelled like him, that still held his presence in every shadowed corner. The real estate agent had given up trying to stage it. The "for sale" sign in the front yard was starting to weather. In his study, buried in the back of his closet behind boxes of old tax returns and expired warranties and forgotten birthday cards, I found a cardboard box I'd missed during my first search. It was unmarked, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. I cut it open with a kitchen knife and sat on the floor of his empty study, surrounded by the ghosts of everything I thought I knew. Inside the box was a folder of photographs. Margaret, young and laughing, her hair a wild tangle of dark curls, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. Margaret holding me as a baby, looking down at my face with an expression I couldn't read. Was it love? Resentment? Some complicated mixture of both. I had never seen these photos before. My father had hidden them away like he'd hidden everything else, burying the evidence of a life I'd never known existed. And there were letters. Dozens of letters, written in Margaret's looping cursive, all addressed to my father. They were postmarked from a post office box in a town called Millbrook, Vermont, a place I'd never heard of, a dot on the map too small to matter. The dates spanned nearly a decade. The earliest ones were desperate, pleading, full of apologies and explanations I couldn't follow, the handwriting shaky and splotched with what might have been tears. The later ones grew calmer, more determined. She wrote about gathering evidence, about an FBI agent named Catherine Reeves she was working with, about Richard Alden, a name that appeared more and more frequently as the years went on. A name that she clearly feared. A name she wrote with a heavier hand, as if the letters themselves were bracing for impact. The last letter was dated 8 months ago. She wrote that she was close to freedom. That she wanted to see me. That she had spent 9 years running and hiding and fighting, and she was finally almost done. She wrote, "I think about you every day, Claire. I know you probably hate me. I know I deserve it. But I'm coming home. I'm going to make things right." 5 months after that letter was written, my father was dead. I read the letters 3 times, sitting on the floor of the study as the afternoon light faded to dusk and the shadows stretched long across the walls. By the time I finished the 3rd reading, my hands were shaking so hard the papers rattled, and I knew what I had to do. Then another text came. Same unknown number. Same clipped, urgent tone, she's in Vermont. Millbrook, Vermont. Go alone. Tell no one. I booked a flight that night. I didn't pack much, a change of clothes, the folder of letters, the photograph of my father and Margaret. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I had learned, in the hardest way possible, that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. Millbrook was exactly the kind of town you'd choose if you wanted to disappear. Tiny, remote, tucked into the Green Mountains like a secret no one bothered to tell. One main street with a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a white steepled church that looked like it hadn't changed in 100 years. Everything else was trees and winding roads and the kind of silence that felt heavy and watchful, as if the mountains themselves were keeping an eye on you. I checked into the only motel in town, a 12-room place with a flickering neon sign that buzzed like an insect and a proprietor who didn't ask questions, just slid a key across the counter and went back to his crossword puzzle. I waited. At 9:47 p.m., a knock at my door woke me from a shallow, restless sleep. I crossed the room on bare feet, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the peephole, I saw a woman with gray hair pulled back from a face that was thinner, more worn than the one in the photographs, but unmistakably familiar. The same high cheekbones. The same shape of the mouth. The face I remembered from my childhood, older now, lined with years of stress and fear and secrets, but still the face of the woman who had tucked me into bed and read me stories and kissed my forehead before turning out the light. Margaret. I opened the door. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She stood in the doorway of my cheap motel room, clutching a manila envelope to her chest like a shield, looking at me with an expression of such desperate hope that it made my throat tight and my eyes sting. "Claire," she said, her voice cracking on the word like it was the first time she'd spoken it in years. "I'm so sorry. Please, just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes, and then if you want me to leave, I'll go. I'll disappear. You'll never have to see me again." I stepped aside and let her in. She told me everything. Sitting on the edge of the motel bed with her hands wrapped around a glass of water she didn't drink, she told me about Richard Alden, a man whose name I would come to hate with every fiber of my being. He was charismatic, she said, the kind of man who walked into a room and made everyone want to please him, the kind of man who made you feel special before he made you feel trapped. He ran a money laundering empire that stretched across 3 continents, and Margaret, young and ambitious and naive, had gotten tangled in his web before she understood what she was doing. When she tried to leave, when she tried to take what she knew to the authorities, he threatened to kill everyone she loved. Her parents. My father. Me. He told me he'd make me watch, she whispered, her voice shaking. He told me he'd make me watch while he hurt you, and then he'd kill me last. I believed him. I still believe him. She faked her own death to escape. Found a body, she couldn't even talk about how without her voice breaking apart, and staged a car accident so convincing that no one questioned it. She left me behind because taking me would have put me in danger, because staying dead was the only way to keep me safe. She said it with tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling so hard the water in her glass rippled, and I sat there frozen, not knowing what to feel, not knowing what to believe. For 9 years, she had been gathering evidence. Working with an FBI agent named Catherine Reeves, a woman who believed her when no one else would. Building a case that could finally bring Richard Alden down. My father, she said, had found her a year ago. She didn't know how, he never told her, and she never asked. But he had believed her story. He had been helping her, in secret, in the months before his death. And then Frank Clark, who had been secretly working for Richard Alden the whole time, a mole planted in my father's life decades ago, had killed him before he could help her finish what she started. The day your father died, Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper, he was supposed to deliver the last piece of evidence we needed. Frank knew. Frank had been watching us the whole time. She handed me the manila envelope. Her hands were trembling so hard she almost dropped it, and I had to reach out and steady her grip. Everything is in here, she said. Bank records. Photographs. Witness statements. A USB drive with encrypted files that will take your breath away. Enough to bring down Richard Alden and everyone who works for him. The FBI has been waiting for this for years, but they need someone to bring it in. Someone who isn't me. Someone who can testify. She grabbed my hands, her grip cold and desperate. I need you to take this to Sarah Chin, a reporter at the Boston Globe. She's been covering organized crime for a decade. She'll know what to do with it. She'll protect you. Claire, I'm dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I have months, maybe weeks. I want to make things right before I go. It's the only thing I have left to do. Please. Please help me finish this. I took the envelope. My hands were steady, steadier than I felt. Inside were hundreds of pages of documentation, organized with the meticulous care of someone who had spent nearly a decade preparing for a single moment. Bank statements, wire transfers, photographs of men in expensive suits shaking hands in dimly lit restaurants. And at the bottom, a photograph, my father and Margaret, young and happy, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something I would never know. They looked like people who believed the future was still full of light. I called her number at dawn, after a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling. I'll do it, I said. But you're coming with me. I'm not letting you disappear again. Not this time. We drove to Boston together. 8 hours in my rented sedan, through mountain roads that wound through forests still bare from winter, past small towns with white-steepled churches and frozen lakes that glittered under the pale February sun. Margaret told me fragments of her past in pieces, as if the memories were too sharp to handle all at once. Meeting my father at a party in Cambridge when she was 22 and he was 24 and everything still seemed possible. The early years of their marriage, before the money ran out and the stress set in and the door to Richard Alden's world opened just wide enough for her to slip through. The slow, creeping terror of realizing what Richard really was, of understanding that the man who smiled at her across boardroom tables was capable of things she couldn't let herself imagine. She talked until her voice went hoarse and cracked, and then she slept with her head against the cold window, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever imagined her. At the Boston Globe building, I met Sarah Chin, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s with short dark hair and an expression that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. She listened to our story without interrupting, her face unreadable, her pen tapping a steady rhythm against her notebook. When I handed over the envelope, she flipped through the documents with practiced efficiency, her eyes moving quickly over the pages. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she looked up, and there was something in her eyes that looked almost like the light of a hunter who had finally spotted her prey. "This is everything we've been trying to get for years," she said, her voice low and intense. "We've been chasing Richard Alden's shadow for a decade. Every time we got close, witnesses disappeared, evidence vanished, stories got killed before they could run. But this," she tapped the folder with her finger. "This is different. The story will run in a week. We'll need to verify everything, but if even half of this is true, Richard Alden is going to prison for the rest of his life." We hid in a cabin in the Berkshires while we waited. Sarah had arranged it, a remote A-frame tucked deep into the woods, accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud in the spring thaw. It was cold and drafty, the windows rattling in their frames whenever the wind picked up, but it was safe. It was ours. For a week, Margaret and I lived in that cabin, and slowly, painfully, we began to talk. Really talk, the way we never had when I was a child and she was playing a role she never wanted. She told me about the day I was born, how small I was, how loud my cry, how she held me in her arms and promised she would protect me no matter what. She told me about the years she spent watching me from a distance she couldn't cross, standing at the edge of school playgrounds and park benches, always too far away to touch. She told me about the nights she lay awake in whatever cheap motel she was hiding in, wondering if I hated her, if I remembered her, if I was safe. I told her about my father's depression. About the days he couldn't get out of bed and the weeks he barely spoke. About finding his body on a Tuesday afternoon, the pill bottle still in his hand, a cup of cold coffee on the desk beside him. About the months of numbness that followed, the way I moved through the world like a ghost, going through the motions of living without really being alive. We cried a lot. We sat in silence a lot. We were strangers who shared a history neither of us had chosen, trying to build something new from the wreckage of everything that had come before. On the night before publication, my phone buzzed. "Unknown number, same as before, they know where you are. Leave. Now." I looked out the window and saw headlights cutting through the trees, 2 pairs of them, moving up the dirt road toward the cabin. We fled through the back door, crashing through the dark woods behind the cabin as an SUV screeched to a halt in the gravel driveway. Margaret knew a logging trail. She had scouted escape routes the moment we arrived, a habit born from 9 years of running and hiding. We stumbled through the darkness, branches clawing at our faces and arms, the beam of flashlights sweeping through the trees behind us like searchlights looking for escaped prisoners. I could hear men shouting, their voices carrying through the cold night air. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Margaret's hand found mine in the darkness, and she pulled me forward, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman who was dying. We made it to a 2-lane highway, breathless and bleeding from a dozen scratches, and flagged down a trucker who took us to an all-night diner in a town whose name I never learned. Sarah sent a car to pick us up before sunrise, and we collapsed in a safe house in Somerville, bruised and exhausted and trembling, but alive. Alive. At dawn the next morning, another text, "They're here." I looked out the window and saw a black SUV idling at the curb. 2 men in dark jackets were getting out, their movements coordinated and unhurried. Professionals. Men who had done this before. We slipped through the back alley as they kicked in the front door, the sound of splintering wood echoing off the brick walls like a gunshot. Sarah was waiting in a sedan 3 blocks away, engine running, and she drove us straight to the Globe building, running red lights and taking corners so fast the tires screamed. At 8 a.m., the story broke. The headline stretched across the front page in bold black letters, "The Alden Empire, How a Small-Town Businessman Built a Criminal Dynasty." Richard Alden's face was splashed beneath it, a handsome, smiling man in an expensive suit, the kind of face that made you want to trust him. Beneath the photograph, thousands of words detailing money laundering, witness intimidation, bribery, and at least 3 murders. The FBI moved within hours. By noon, Richard Alden was in handcuffs, Perp walked out of his waterfront mansion in front of a dozen news cameras, and Margaret was weeping in my arms, her thin body shaking with sobs. "It's over," she kept saying, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "It's finally over. After all these years, it's over." But it wasn't //speechsynthesis.online/ver. Not yet. At noon, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, with a Massachusetts area code. A smooth, cultured voice on the other end, the kind of voice that belonged in boardrooms and exclusive clubs and places where power was traded like currency. "Claire Miller. My name is Victor Hale. Elena Davis didn't kill herself. She was murdered. Meet me in the public garden. Come alone." I went. I don't know why I went. Maybe I had learned over the past months that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than not knowing. Maybe I was just too exhausted to be afraid anymore. Maybe some part of me had known all along that the story wasn't finished, that there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. I took a cab to the public garden and found him by the frozen lagoon, a silver-haired man in a cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He was tossing breadcrumbs to a cluster of mallards huddled at the edge of the ice, of all things, and when he turned to face me, his smile was pleasant and polished and utterly, completely cold. "Elena Davis was injected with a paralytic agent," he said, as casually as if he was discussing stock options. "Succinylcholine, to be precise. It leaves very little trace if you don't know what to look for. She was conscious but completely unable to move when someone pressed her fingers to that suicide note, smearing the blood just so, making it look like a desperate final act. Very theatrical. Very effective." He shook his head, almost admiringly. "It wasn't Frank Clark who forged that note. Frank thought he drove her to suicide, that was the whole point, to let him believe it. But the forgery was Margaret's work. Your mother. The woman you've been hiding in a cabin with." I stared at him. The cold from the frozen lagoon seemed to seep into my bones. "You're lying." "Am I?" He pulled a folded document from inside his coat and handed it to me with gloved fingers. A police report, stamped and dated 9 years ago. A burned body found in a warehouse fire on the south side of the city. The body that had been used to fake Margaret's death. Her name was Julia Hart, Victor Hale said, his voice never losing its smooth, conversational tone. She was homeless. No family, no friends, no one to miss her. Margaret killed her, strangled her first, then set the fire. She was thorough. I'll give her that. He paused, watching my face. Your mother was never Richard's victim, Claire. She was his partner. She built the shell companies. She recruited Frank Clark into the organization years ago. She was in that apartment when Elena died. Her fingerprints are on the syringe we recovered. He handed me another document, a fingerprint analysis report. I didn't know how to read it. I didn't know if it was real. But the cold, calm certainty in his voice, the way he met my eyes without flinching, made my stomach turn to ice. Run a DNA comparison, he said. The body from the warehouse against Margaret Miller. You'll see I'm telling the truth. I'm offering you this information because I want immunity, and I want Margaret to take the fall for what happened to Elena. I'm not a good man, Claire. I've done terrible things. But I'm a practical one, and I know when it's time to cut my losses. Help me, and I'll help you finally learn the truth. I walked for hours after that meeting. Through the public garden, down Commonwealth Avenue, across the Charles River into Cambridge and back again. The city blurred around me, all gray skies and cold wind and people rushing past with their heads down, unaware that my world was collapsing for the third time. My feet ached. My mind kept running the same circles, trying to find a version of events where Margaret was innocent, where Victor Hale was lying, where everything I'd started to believe about the woman who raised me wasn't built on another foundation of blood and lies. But I couldn't find one. That night, while Margaret slept in the safe house, her breathing slow and shallow, I took a strand of hair from her pillow. I sent it to a private lab with instructions to compare it against the DNA profile from the warehouse body, the profile Victor Hale had helpfully included in the documents he gave me. And then I waited. The waiting was the hardest part. It always was. That evening, Margaret looked at me across the kitchen table, her eyes tired but warm, and said, "You're my daughter, Claire. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters. I know I wasn't the mother you deserved, but I loved you. I still love you. That was never a lie. Not by blood." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Because I hadn't told her about the DNA test with Elena. I hadn't told her that the test had come back positive, that I'd found my biological mother and lost her in the same brutal week. There was no way Margaret should have known that Elena and I weren't biologically related, unless she already knew the test was fake. Unless she had orchestrated the whole thing from the beginning. I confronted her. The words came out of me in a flood, accusations and questions and demands, my voice rising until I was almost shouting. Margaret's face went through a series of transformations, first shock, then denial, then a flicker of something that looked like anger, and finally, a terrible, exhausted resignation that was worse than any of the others. "Yes," she whispered, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. "The DNA test with Elena was faked. I paid off the lab technician. It wasn't hard, a few $1,000s, a threat or two. Elena was just a pawn. Someone who owed Richard money, someone desperate enough to play whatever role we gave her. She wasn't your mother. She was never your mother. I thought if you believed you'd found your real mother, you'd stop looking. You'd stop digging. You'd be safe." She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with tears that I couldn't tell were real or rehearsed. "I'm not your biological mother, Claire. I never was. I don't know who your real parents are. I don't know where you came from. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." At midnight, the lab results came. I opened the email with shaking fingers, the screen of my phone too bright in the darkness of the safe house. Margaret's DNA was a match for the body from the warehouse fire. The woman who died in that fire, the woman whose charred remains had been used to fake Margaret's death, was named Julia Hart. She was 34 years old. She had been strangled before the fire was set, the hyoid bone fractured in a way that left no doubt. I looked at Margaret, sitting across the room with her hands folded in her lap, and I saw her differently. I saw the hardness beneath the tears, the calculation behind the apologies. She had killed Julia Hart. She had killed Elena Davis. She had built a criminal empire alongside Richard Alden and then tried to tear it down only when it suited her. And somewhere in the middle of all that, she had raised me, loved me, lied to me. She admitted everything. The partnership with Richard. The shell companies, the money laundering, the bribes and threats that kept their operation running for over a decade. The recruitment of Frank Clark, a man whose resentment of my father made him easy to manipulate. The murder of Julia Hart, a crime she said she still saw in her nightmares, the woman's face appearing every time she closed her eyes. And when she was done confessing, her voice hoarse and broken, she whispered, "I don't know who your real parents are. I don't know where you came from. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. But I did love you. Whatever else I did love you. That much was real. I didn't know if I believed her. I still don't. Victor Hale called the next morning. I agreed to testify against Margaret and Richard and everyone else. In exchange, he would receive a reduced sentence and enter witness protection. It was a devil's bargain, a deal with a man who was as guilty as anyone else in this story, but I was past caring about the moral calculus. I wanted the truth. Whatever was left of it. I wanted to be able to sleep at night without seeing Elena's blood-smeared face or my father's empty pill bottle or the look in Frank's eyes when his mask finally slipped. At dawn, FBI agent Catherine Reeves arrived at the safe house. She was tall and calm, with the kind of quiet competence that immediately put me at ease. She had been working with Margaret for years, she told me, and she had believed in her. She was still processing the betrayal, and I could see the hurt beneath her professional composure. I told her everything, every revelation, every lie, every death. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes in a small leather notebook. When I was finished, she sat back in her chair and regarded me with something that looked almost like sympathy. "We cross-referenced your DNA with the national database," she said, her voice gentle. "After everything you've been through, we thought you deserved to know the truth, at least this part of it. Your biological mother is alive. Her name is Rebecca Thorne. She's in witness protection in Oregon. She testified against a different criminal organization about 24 years ago and has been in hiding ever since. She was pregnant when she went into the program. She gave birth to you in a safe house in Portland and was forced to give you up for your own safety. She's been looking for you ever since. She never stopped." Agent Reeves handed me a photograph. A woman with dark hair and a familiar smile, my smile. My eyes. The same shape of the face, the same tilt of the chin. She was older than me, wearier, her face lined with years of hiding and waiting and hoping, but she was unmistakably, undeniably mine. I stared at that photograph for a long time, tracing the lines of her face with my fingertip, looking for pieces of myself. Looking for an explanation for why my life had unfolded the way it had. Looking for something that felt like home. Margaret was arrested that afternoon. She didn't fight it. She went quietly, her head bowed, her hands cuffed behind her back. At the door, she paused and looked back at me, her eyes searching my face for something I wasn't sure I had to give. "I did love you," she said. "Whatever else I did, whatever else I was, I did love you. I need you to know that." I didn't answer. I didn't know how. The words I wanted to say were too tangled, too complicated, too full of gratitude and rage and grief and loss to fit into any sentence I could construct. So I just watched her go, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that felt like the end of something. Richard Alden and Frank Clark were convicted on multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and money laundering. Their trials lasted weeks, filling the headlines Sarah Chin had helped create, and I testified at all of them. Sitting in that witness box, meeting their eyes across the courtroom, was the hardest thing I've ever done. Frank looked at me once, just once, and his expression was completely blank, as if I was a stranger he'd never met. Richard Alden smiled. He actually smiled, a cold, confident smile that made my skin crawl. But the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony unshakable. They will spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. Victor Hale got his deal, 15 years in a minimum security facility, followed by lifetime witness protection. Margaret received 25 years. She'll be in her 70s when she's released, if she lives that long. 3 days after the last verdict was read, I flew to Portland, Oregon. The airport terminal was crowded with travelers and families and people holding signs with names written in marker. I walked through the arrival gate on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had imagined this moment so many times over the past few months, what it would feel like, what she would look like, whether I would know what to say. None of my imaginings had prepared me for the reality. She was standing near the baggage claim, apart from the crowd, her hands clasped in front of her like she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. She was older than her photograph, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with years of hiding and waiting and hoping. But her smile was my smile. And when she saw me, when our eyes met across the crowded terminal, her hand flew to her mouth, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She didn't try to wipe them away. "Claire," she said, my name coming out of her mouth like a prayer. "My daughter." I stepped forward, and she held me. She held me the way I'd imagined a mother should hold her child, tight and fierce and tender all at once, her arms wrapped around me like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. She smelled like lavender and something warm and familiar that I couldn't name, something that felt like it had been waiting for me my whole life. And standing there in that crowded airport terminal with strangers streaming past us on all sides, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very, very long time. I felt like I was where I belonged. There are still questions I may never answer. Still years of pain and betrayal to work through. Still nights when I wake up gasping from dreams about my father's study or Elena's hospital room or Margaret's face as they led her away. The worst is over, but the healing has only just begun. I am learning to live with the not knowing, with the loose ends that may never be tied. I am learning to trust again, slowly, carefully, the way you learn to walk after an injury. I am learning that family isn't always blood, and blood isn't always family, and sometimes the truest thing you can do is keep moving forward even when you can't see the path ahead. Rebecca and I talk every day now. We are learning each other in the way of strangers who share a history written in DNA and absence. Some conversations are easy, filled with laughter and discovery. Others are hard, weighted with all the years we lost, all the moments that were stolen from us. But we keep talking. We keep showing up. That is its own kind of healing. The story isn't finished. Some days I think it never will be, that stories like mine don't have clean endings, only the next chapter, and the one after that. But for the first time in my life, I'm the one holding the pen. I'm the one deciding what comes next. And that, I think, is enough. That is everything.